Welcome everyone to another episode of Cyber Talk with Nikolay show. Today we're going to be discussing our conversation around Holy Grail, and that is identity and access management protection, the topic that's been somewhat not discussed for many years. And we spend a lot of time on building different controls, but at the end of the day, we left IAM, our identity and access management system, largely unprotected from any cyber threat attacks, and in hopes that when threat actors get in, they're not going to find what they're looking for. But we all know that all cyber attacks are leading to exactly the same thing. So everything is happening, and once somebody get foothold of any organization, first thing they're trying to do elevate their admin rights and elevate their credentials and make things work. So in order to stay ahead of the game, we need to deploy additional control to make sure those things are covered. And today we have a special guest from Semperis and Sean Deuby. He's principal technologist for North America and spent a lot of time looking at identity and access management space, protecting identities, and he's going to share with us his thoughts. And I have a lot of questions, but we're going to make it lovely and conversation flowing through our discussion. So with that said, I'd like to introduce himself on to Sean Deuby. Sean, give us a few words about yourself and experience in protecting identity.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Nikolay. I like to say I've been doing Microsoft identity as long as Microsoft has been doing identity. I was one of the original architects of Intel's Active Directory, and before that in Windows NT. And so I've lived in this space for a long time with large enterprises and making it all work. And then I went off and sort of like this, I was a technology journalist for many years and a consultant for the Microsoft hybrid suite of on-prem identity, and then, as we called it at the time, Azure Active Directory and all of the security products associated with it. 15-time Microsoft MVP for identity, and now I've sort of come full circle back to Active Directory and protecting Active Directory because it's under such threat and such attack right now. So I feel like I'm at the right place to sort of try to help people understand the risks that they face and how to protect their hybrid Active Directory environment. And by hybrid, I mean Active Directory on premises and what we're now calling Entra ID in the cloud as a holistic Microsoft identity solution.
Great. Thank you, Sean. So without further ado, let's just dive into this critical topic for all organizations. So could you describe risk and exposure of identity Active Directory and Azure Active Directory when incidents do happen? What actually happens and what threat actors are looking for and why it's so critical for us to focus on identity and access management?
Well, the risk and exposure, I think, especially if also people that are listening to your shows are aware of, is that the vast majority of attacks and cyber attacks and indeed nation state attacks originate with identity. And not only do they originate with identity, and that's pretty well known now, is they propagate through the identity system for the threat actors to either to take control of applications, to exfiltrate data, or to just infiltrate and or corrupt the environment in terms of cybercrime so they can extort the organization for money. Risk-wise, especially if you're looking at IT decision makers, and of course they focus on risk and a risk dashboard, is it green, is it yellow, is it red? The way I describe it in terms of Active Directory and the identity system, I mean, this applies to identity in general, but Active Directory, I think it's more than 90% of the Fortune 1000 around the world and organizations around the world in general. More than 90% of organizations over about 500 people depend on Active Directory as, if not their primary identity store, one of their primary identity stores. And so you look at that, and the first thing, it's kind of marvelous when you consider that it's a 25-year-old, 24-year-old technology is still so dependent. The world is still so dependent on it. And even more now because it's the basis for hybrid identity, where you extend your identity into the cloud with Entra ID or Okta or Salesforce, you name it. Active Directory on-prem is being used as the basis for identity service providers in the cloud. So in terms of availability and ubiquitousness of the service, it's everywhere. So this is pertinent to everybody. And the threat actors know it too, because conservatively, 90% of cyber attacks in the last 5 years have involved Active Directory. Mandiant has stated that for their clients that they go in and do forensic analysis for, that more than 90% of their clients, they find that Active Directory has either been used directly, as in attacked and held ransom directly, or is used as a means to an end as they propagate through the network to gain access to applications, critical databases, critical customer data, which they then exfiltrate to extort. So the cyber kill chain, the vast majority of times, it uses identity for initial access, whether they've gotten it from the dark web or whether they've phished a user for their credentials, or if the user has a weak or a common password and they fall victim to a password spray attack, or less commonly, they gain access through to an internet-facing gateway through a vulnerability, a VPN or some other gateway device, or a VPN that does not have a second factor like MFA on it. So a threat actor can somehow gain credentials, which we know there's a lot of ways, as I've just described, and a common access. And then this is from conversations that I've had with, for example, Microsoft DART personnel, their Microsoft's own incident response team. Very common attack path is to gain credentials, find an internet-facing gateway into an organization, if it's a VPN, if it's a gateway device, or if it's a server that's exposed to the internet, an RDP exposure to the internet.
Okay.
They use those credentials to log into the network, log into the facing server, look around on the server, perhaps defeat the endpoint protection strategy, harvest credentials from that server, and then move through the network. They use Active Directory to find other clients on the network, to find servers, to find resources, to find service accounts on the network, and they move around the network until they are able to escalate their privileges
before you leave.
to
I just talked to
a high level of privilege in Active Directory.
I forgot his name. His name is
we
Ken?
call domain
The
dominance.
electrician,
And
Kenny.
at that
I just talked
point,
to him.
they
He had a little
have the
quick
ability to
question
control
on
any
the,
application that depends on Active Directory
the cords
in
that
the on-premises
go
environment,
into the
which
server or
is
the network room.
most applications nowadays.
So do you
Furthermore,
want to place all four of them,
when
or
they
just
do gain
what do you
control of
want to do
Active
with those two
Directory,
things? All
they
four
can
just
also
get
gain
power-
control of the
power lines.
Entra ID Connect server. This is the server that synchronizes accounts with on-premises
Okay,
with
that's
Entra
what-
ID, which means they can then escalate and gain control
Oh, really? He
of
wasn't.
Entra ID as well.
Okay.
And
That's what I
so
told
they
Ken.
have
That's what I told Kenny.
they have the
I
whole
said, I don't
thing.
know.
They
I
have the
don't
Holy
think it
Grail,
did,
as you
because told him
put
that
in
we
your
might have a 10
in
one
your
about a whole
episode
section.
headline. So in terms of risk, we look at a risk assessment. A classic risk assessment is what are the vulnerabilities to the system? What is the likelihood of that
That's what Bala said?
threat attacking that vulnerability? And what is the impact if that threat actually
that's
takes
why they
place?
canceled the meeting.
In terms of Active Directory, so you have vulnerabilities. And I didn't talk to this earlier, but the reality is most of us have had Active Directory in place for many, many years, decades. The oldest of us, like I said, a quarter of a century.
Right.
So what you have is a quarter of a century of a service that's in production
Yes, he has.
that has had users and groups added to it, and maybe not removed, or applications added to it that were maybe not implemented using least privilege because they just had to get the job done. They couldn't afford to spend 4 or 5 days getting it done right. So they gave the application a little more privileges than necessary because it works. And you take those examples and you multiply that by 10, 15, 20 years. Every Active Directory environment has a host of vulnerabilities to it. It's sort of the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I see what Kevin's trying to do.
Semperis makes a free community tool called Purple Knight. It's got more than, I think, 30,000 downloads now. And it's a snapshot Active Directory security assessment. And not just Active Directory, but Active Directory and Entra ID and Okta as well. And it evaluates those environments for vulnerabilities. And when we get feedback from organizations that have run Purple Knight, and we don't see any of the feedback ourselves at all, it's just if they choose to reveal some information, we find that, as you might expect, everybody has vulnerabilities for those reasons that I described. So for the risk assessment, you have vulnerabilities. Okay, yes, everybody's got vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities are very high. You have the likelihood of that vulnerability being attacked, the threat. And as I've said, Mandiant, Microsoft, others say that 90% of cyber attacks use Active Directory. So that's very high.
What you told me.
And then you have the impact of that attack occurring, of that threat occurring, which with Active Directory is extremely high, because if Active Directory is down, your applications are down, likely your communications are down, your workstations are down, even your regular communications may be down, because so much is Active Directory dependent. I joke that some organizations need to keep a chair by the machine room window of their data center, so that if Active Directory is down and their physical security doesn't work anymore, you can throw the chair through the window so you can get into your servers. So what that means, basically, as you're hearing me say, is the vulnerabilities are high. The risk is very high. The impact is very high. So when you look at it as a risk assessment, your Active Directory risk in most organizations is very high. And I think that historically, many IT leaders don't really realize that, because historically Active Directory has always just kind of worked. It's always been there, but it wasn't designed. It wasn't designed for this kind of a world that we live in right now. I mean, it works operationally wonderfully, but these threats didn't exist when Active Directory was designed.
Yeah, definitely.
I kind of got a little confused.
Thank you, Sean, for that. So from your perspective, and you described very well what the risk is and what can happen when the risk comes to materialize. And so one thing that I'm looking for, like Active Directory has been around for literally decades, ever since we start using authentication mechanism, and probably for the past 20, 25 plus years. It's been actively used, and companies not that eager to jump, and it's kind of one of the things. It works, it sits in the backend, but every compromise that literally happened there leads to Active Directory. Credential exposure are still in hashes, still in all the identities, and they're using them and trying to break into other applications. So how would you describe current level of protection of Active Directory? From your experience, I'm pretty sure you visited quite a few organizations by now. And what do you see, or what do you hear? Why would somebody says, yes, I know this is there, the risk is extremely high. It's pretty much everything leads to Active Directory, yet nobody really spends a whole lot of time protecting Active Directory. Most money right now is being spent on external perimeter security awareness training, which is necessary, needed to security awareness months going through. We certainly need to pay attention to it, but I'm yet to see budget being increased in certain areas where actually, here is what we need to do to address this particular risk, because Even when you take a simple example, every organization conducts internal auditors or internal audits. So they hire all the pen testers from all those big organizations. They let them in, and lo and behold, 10 minutes later, those pen testers got hold of domain credentials or these unknown vulnerabilities or other things. And at the end, the report is issued that you have problem with network, but even those reports are not pointing out that Active Directory largely is not protected, or Entra is the same thing. They can break into it, they can get everything else. So it's like, okay, everything is great. We need to put controls in place to prevent people from getting there. But at the same time, nobody's highlighting the fact that the central repository of all identities is largely unprotected. So, from your experience, what have you seen, and what do your customers or people share with you? Like, why don't they protect Active Directory, and why the level of protection where it currently is?
I sort of look at it in three aspects to it, and this because we like to work in frameworks as humans. The NIST cybersecurity framework of, let's say, before the attack, during the attack, and after the attack. And one aspect I talked about is the vulnerabilities. So imagine, you have a pen test or you have a security audit from, let's say, a cyber insurance company. And one of the things that they come away with is that there's a ton of vulnerabilities in Active Directory. So number one, use a free tool like Purple Knight and find out what your big vulnerabilities are. And because it will clearly point them out, it will show where they are in the cyber attack framework, and it'll give you steps on how to mitigate those risks. The second, and I think of this, and this is, if a threat actor is trying to get in the environment, or if they have succeeded in getting in the environment, is this layered approach. We focus a lot in the industry on endpoint detection and response. And we rightly should focus on endpoint detection and response. The threat actor, let's use my example of the internet-facing VPN with only user ID and password and no second factor. Threat actor gains control they gain some credentials. They log into the VPN and let's say, or the gateway, and they're on the gateway, and they've managed to stay on the gateway maybe 9 times out of 10. The endpoint detection and response kicks them out. But let's say they manage to stay in the gateway. So what then? They use the identity system and they try to move through the identity system. So if you're thinking about it as a layered response, protecting the identity system, is partly endpoint detection and responses responsibility, but not the service itself. In other words, Active Directory lives on domain controllers. Domain controllers are Windows servers. Windows servers, you want to protect them from malware on it. Well and good. If the threat actor is able to move around in the environment, and for example, they use an attack that has become very popular called Kerber roasting, and I won't dive into detail on what Kerber roasting is. Let's just say I was talking about the 20 plus years of hurried security choices when implementing applications. There's lots of service accounts in most organizations that have privileged access. Kerber roasting is a way to very quickly get the password hash of a service account with privileged access, and boom, the threat actor has privileged access. So at that point, they're able to get onto a domain controller, and they may be able to make changes to the Active Directory service itself. We talk about zero trust all the time, and I know you recently had an episode where you talked about zero trust and how identity is a core component, if not the core component, to a zero trust architecture. I think we've pretty well established that Active Directory is a core identity system for most organizations. So therefore, Active Directory is or the core component of a zero trust architecture. So if the threat actor gets into Active Directory, the service itself, and is able to make changes to the service that you're not aware of, or maybe very much aware of because they kick all the other administrators out of Active Directory. That's where Active Directory needs to be protected. That's where the identity service itself needs to be protected. And you need to be able to restore trust in Active Directory. And it's not just Active Directory, as you implied earlier. It's also Entra ID, in the cloud identity system, and that's completely outside the purview of endpoint detection and response. So if you think about it from a layered response viewpoint, follow the cyber kill chain. The threat actor comes in to an endpoint most of the time. They propagate through the network, through other endpoints, but once they get to Active Directory, you need to protect Active Directory. If we've proven the bad guys always seem to go through Active Directory, yeah, that needs to be protected. And so you need to be able to both see the changes that are being made in Active Directory. That's one aspect to it. A challenge with Active Directory is that it's very difficult to roll back changes to Active Directory, especially if you have an active threat actor in the environment that is making changes. It's the process for restoring sections of Active Directory is very burdensome. It involves taking a domain controller offline, mounting a backup, choosing what you want to restore. It's not an activity that can keep up with a threat actor making changes in the environment. So that's a challenge. But at the very least, you need to be able to monitor that. And if you can get the ability to be able to roll back those changes. So that's before the attack. And then we've just talked about during the attack. And so after the attack is actually one of the real challenges, because the nature of Active Directory as a distributed application is that it's extremely difficult to bring back after a cyber attack. And we get into all sorts of human nature in this. Oh, it's probably good enough. Oh, we feel pretty good about these things. But the reality is it is extraordinarily difficult. I was just on a call shortly before our conversation. And in this conversation, what often happens as we talk to customers, or we just talk to organizations in general, is they say, we're pretty good. We think we have scripts to recover Active Directory from a cyber attack. And what we've seen again and again and again is that when they actually sit down and they actually work through the script and they work through the process that they have, which many times comes from a classic Active Directory disaster, which is more related to physical disasters or corruption of the Active Directory database, not a threat actor going in, dropping malware on domain controllers and inserting persistence or other changes in AD. It's a different scenario. These hand-built scripts and tests often fail. And remember, when Active Directory is down because of a cyber attack, everything's down. Practically everything's down. The way I say, everybody's running around with their hair on fire trying to get this figured out. And the recovery process for Active Directory, which is a 29-step, 28-step process from Microsoft called Forest Recovery, is very complicated, very detail-oriented. It's not spelled out well in the documentation. You have to take it and make it your own. And in organizations of any size, it takes days and multiple days, in some cases, even weeks, to bring Active Directory back. And the company isn't functioning until then. So those are the risks. And especially this recovery aspect is what IT management often doesn't realize. Is it's not just like restoring a file server or a SharePoint server. If you're going to restore Active Directory, it's actually far more complicated than that, because not only do you have to make sure the malware is not on the domain controllers, but you have to make sure the service is trustworthy. And that can be extraordinarily difficult to ensure.
Yeah, definitely, Sean. And I think you covered it pretty well. So from what I've heard you saying and what I'm seeing, So most organizations that you visited to or you had conversation with, they know the risks and they know what is going to happen if somebody is going to break in. But it seems like there is level of acceptance. It's like, okay, so what? Yes, I know all those things, and I'll move along. And is it because nothing was available that would extend this and help organizations to deal with the risk, or what do you think? Why they accepted it and says yes, so I know all the steps and I have to go and recover it, and it's going to be a painful process. And I've been on some incidents where they have to change golden tickets, and that took several days for organizations to go through. Like from your perspective, why do you think organizations going through acceptance of the risk rather than figuring out how to mitigate the risk or
I think
reduce it?
I think it's a lot of it is visibility, to be perfectly honest, because when we talk to for example, when we talk to infrastructure teams about our forest recovery tool, Active Directory Forest Recovery, and we tell them, look, it goes from this, it takes this 28-step process that you have to construct very, very carefully orchestrated procedures, and I mean human procedures too. So imagine you have an organization that's down and you have to communicate with a server operator in a computer room somewhere, and your regular communications don't work. I hear stories of literally using FaceTime from your phones and showing the computer screens on FaceTime so the engineers at the other end can tell what's going on. To be able to take that stressful and complicated process and to be able to reduce it to 6 clicks of a dialogue and standing back and letting the recovery happen. What we have found is that organizations, they jump on it when because of the risk associated with Active Directory and the cost associated with Active Directory being down, the tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. People do want to find ways to shorten the recovery period, and what we have found is that it's an average of 90% reduction in recovery time. And the other aspect of it that tends to be underemphasized is it removes the human component, the highly stressed human component from that recovery process. In addition, with tools to help you find out what changes the threat actor has made in Active Directory to eject them. So you can see where they have added themselves to administrative groups or maybe established persistence in other subtle ways so that they can get back in after the fact. During, again, I think it's a visibility aspect to it, because tools a few years ago didn't exist to be able to show you all of the changes that were going on in Active Directory and who made the changes. So you can literally see the changes that threat actors were making into your Active Directory and to be able to roll those changes back. We have a solution called Directory Services Protector that allows you to see all of the changes that are happening in Active Directory and Entra ID, and to be able to, with the check of a checkbox, to be able to roll those changes back. So you can actively combat a threat actor in your environment without having to try to mount backups and to restore sections of your directory much more quickly. That's the way, that's, to me, this is really simple stuff. It comes down to everybody has Active Directory. All the bad guys target Active Directory. You have to come up with better ways to protect and to recover Active Directory. And we had made some mention about some examples, perhaps, where Active Directory had been attacked. There are many, and once you learn to look for them, you'll see them everywhere. Dish Network, if you look in the press about an attack, and you'll see the mention of domain controllers, or you see the mention of exfiltration of the user database. Or so, as I said, Dish Network came up as one example. You can look other examples. City of Dallas, their action report specifically called out how the threat actors used and took advantage of Active Directory. Really big one about a year ago, and we know a fair amount about this because the threat actors published some information. Really big one is MGM Resorts. So that was in November of last year. To me, this is a classic example of asymmetrical warfare, of why you can't stick your head in the sand and you have to be prepared for an attack. So on one side, MGM Resorts was, I think it's a $6.4 billion company. On the other side, you have a group called Scattered Spider, which according to security vendor descriptions is a loose collection of 19 to 21-year-old native English speakers. I mean, how is this for a comparison? And what they did, what became well known, is that they were able to social engineer the help desk to gain accounts into MGM Resorts. It's a little unclear as to whether they got administrative accounts right away or not, but they got administrative access to Active Directory. And in the threat actor's own statements, they said to be able to dump the user database to gain access to the user's password hashes. That's Active Directory. They got control of AD. They got onto a domain controller. They exfiltrated the NTS.dit database, and they cracked it. And when they did that, they gained control of Active Directory. They gained control of Azure AD or Entra ID Connect. So they got control of Azure. They also got control of their Okta footprint. And then when MGM didn't cooperate with them and tried to fight back, the threat actors, because they had control of Active Directory, and this is not explicitly stated, but this is not a great leap of imagination. Because they had control of Active Directory controls applications like backup utilities, and it also controls access to utilities like vCenter. So the VMware ESXi environment, you log on and typically log on to these environments with an Active Directory account. If you own Active Directory, you can have administrative access to your ESXi servers. So what the threat actors did was they went out and they proceeded to encrypt or otherwise disable or destroy hundreds of ESXi host servers, taking down thousands of virtual machines. That is not at all atypical, but one of the more clearly semi-documented instances of threat actors using Active Directory to take control of your environment.
Right. Thank you for joining us for part 1, Protecting the Holy Grail with Sean Deuby, Principal Technologist in North America for Semperis, and stay tuned for part 2.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.